My daughter left the ultrasound appointment happy and ready to tell her husband the news that she was having a boy. An hour later, she called me crying, "Mom, please, I need your help." I panicked. When I discovered what my son-in-law had done, the truth froze me. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Peyton's name, and my heart immediately lifted. My daughter had her 20-week ultrasound appointment that morning, and I'd been waiting all day to hear whether I'd be welcoming a grandson or granddaughter. "Peyton, honey," I answered cheerfully. "How did it go? What are we having?" Instead of the excited voice I expected, I heard sobbing. Deep, uncontrolled sobs that made my blood run cold. "Mom," she gasped between tears. "Mom, please, I need your help. I need you to come over right now." I dropped the towel I was holding, my hands suddenly shaking. "Peyton, what's wrong? What happened at the appointment?" "It's a boy, Mom. We're having a boy." Her voice cracked on the words like she was forcing them out. "But Matthew, when the technician told us, he went completely white. He didn't say anything. He just stared at the screen like he'd seen a ghost." My mind raced, trying to understand. Maybe he was just overwhelmed, sweetheart. Sometimes men react differently to news like that. "No, Mom, you don't understand." Peyton's voice dropped to a whisper, and I could hear her moving around, like she was checking to make sure she was alone. After we left the clinic, he drove home in complete silence. I tried talking to him, asking what was wrong, but he wouldn't respond. When we got to the house, he went straight to his office and locked the door. I grabbed my car keys, already heading toward the front door. "I'm coming over right now. Wait, there's more." She took a shuddering breath. I could hear him in there, Mom, moving things around, opening and closing drawers. It sounded like he was looking for something. Then I heard him on the phone, but he was talking so quietly I couldn't make out the words. When he finally came out, his eyes were red, like he'd been crying. This didn't sound like the Matthew I knew. My son-in-law had always been composed, maybe too composed. In the 3 years he'd been married to Peyton, I'd rarely seen him show strong emotion about anything. He was successful, well-dressed, and polite, but there was something distant about him that I'd never been able to put my finger on. "Did you ask him what was wrong?" "I tried," Peyton said, her voice breaking again. "I asked if he was okay, if he was excited about having a son. He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Then he said he had to go out for a while, that he needed to think. Mom, that was 4 hours ago. He won't answer his phone, and I have no idea where he is. I was already in my car, backing out of my driveway. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't worry, honey. We'll figure this out." But as I drove through the familiar streets of our suburb, my mind kept returning to the strange details of Peyton's story. Why would finding out the baby's gender cause such an extreme reaction? Most expectant fathers I knew were thrilled to learn they were having a son. When I pulled into Peyton and Matthew's driveway, I noticed his black sedan wasn't there. The house looked dark except for a few lights in the living room windows. Before I could even knock, the front door opened, and Peyton fell into my arms. She looked terrible. Her usually perfect blonde hair was disheveled. Her mascara had run in dark streaks down her cheeks, and she was still wearing the loose dress she'd put on for her appointment that morning. "Thank God you're here," she whispered against my shoulder. I held her tight, the way I had when she was a little girl and had scraped her knee or lost a toy. But this felt different. This felt bigger, more dangerous. "Come on, let's sit down and talk," I said, guiding her to the couch in their pristine living room. Everything in this house was always perfectly arranged, not a cushion out of place. It was Matthew's influence, I knew. He liked order, control. Peyton curled up next to me, pulling her knees to her chest like a child seeking protection. "Mom, I keep thinking about the way he looked at the ultrasound screen. It wasn't surprise or joy or even disappointment. It was fear. Pure fear. Fear of what? That's what I can't figure out. We've talked about having children since before we got married. He always said he wanted kids. When I got pregnant, he seemed happy. He's been reading parenting books, setting up the nursery. But today, when we saw our son on that screen, she shook her head. It was like something inside him just broke. I rubbed her back, trying to soothe her while my own anxiety grew. Did the technician say anything unusual about the baby? Any concerns? No, everything looks perfect. The baby is healthy, developing normally. That's what makes this so confusing. Peyton sat up straighter, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Mom, there's something else. While Matthew was locked in his office, I heard him say a name on the phone. A name I'd never heard before. My pulse quickened. What name? Jacob. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. He said, I can't do this again. Not another Jacob. Mom, we don't know anyone named Jacob. Matthew has never mentioned anyone by that name. The words hung in the air between us like a dark cloud. Not another Jacob. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. It implied there had been a first Jacob, someone or something Matthew was trying to avoid repeating. Peyton, I need you to think carefully. Has Matthew ever talked about his past relationships? His family? Anything that might help us understand what's happening? She shook her head slowly. You know how private he is. He said his parents died in a car accident when he was in college, and he doesn't have any siblings. He told me he didn't like talking about the past because it was too painful. I respected that. Maybe I shouldn't have. As I sat there holding my frightened daughter, a terrible thought began forming in my mind. What if we didn't know Matthew at all? What if the man Peyton had married, the man who was about to become the father of my grandchild, was hiding something so significant that learning he was having a son could trigger this kind of breakdown? The sound of a car door slamming made us both jump. Through the window, I could see Matthew's sedan in the driveway. Peyton gripped my hand tightly. He's back, she whispered, and I could hear the fear in her voice. We watched as Matthew walked slowly toward the front door, his shoulders slumped, his usually perfect posture gone. When he stepped inside, he looked like a man who had aged years in a single day. Matthew stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes moving from Peyton to me and back again. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, his shirt wrinkled, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. Pamela, he said quietly, not seeming particularly surprised to see me there. I should have expected you'd call your mother. There was something in his tone that I didn't like, a subtle criticism that made my protective instincts flare, but I kept my voice calm. She was worried about you, Matthew. We both are. He walked past us into the kitchen without another word. I heard the refrigerator open, the sound of ice clinking into a glass, then the distinctive pop of a beer bottle being opened. In the 3 years I'd known him, I'd never seen Matthew drink during the day. Peyton followed him, and I stayed close behind. He was standing at the kitchen island, staring down at his beer like it might hold answers to questions he couldn't voice. Matthew, please talk to me, Peyton said, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened today? Why did you leave like that? He took a long drink before responding. I needed time to think. About what? About our son? The hurt in Peyton's voice was unmistakable. Matthew's jaw tightened. About everything. About whether I'm ready for this. The casual cruelty of those words hit me like a physical blow. Peyton was 22 weeks pregnant, showing clearly now, glowing with the joy of impending motherhood. The time for questioning readiness had long passed. You seemed ready yesterday, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. You seemed ready when you helped paint the nursery last weekend. His eyes snapped to mine, and for just a moment, I saw something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't embarrassment or guilt. It was calculation, like he was trying to figure out how much I knew, how much of a threat I posed to whatever secret he was protecting. Things change, Pamela. Sometimes you realize you're not who you thought you were. Peyton moved closer to him, her hand reaching for his arm. Matthew, please. Whatever this is about, we can work through it together. That's what marriage means. He pulled away from her touch, and I watched my daughter's face crumble. In that moment, I saw something I'd been too blind to notice before. How often Matthew subtly rejected Peyton's affection, how he controlled their social interactions, how he'd gradually isolated her from some of her friends by always having reasons they couldn't attend gatherings. "I'm going to take a shower," he announced, setting his half-empty beer on the counter with a sharp clink. "I need to clear my head." As soon as we heard his footsteps on the stairs, Peyton collapsed onto one of the kitchen stools. "Did you see the way he looked at me? Like I was some kind of burden?" I put my arms around her, but my mind was racing. Something about this whole situation felt orchestrated, like Matthew was playing a part in a script only he could see. His emotional breakdown this morning, his mysterious disappearance, and now this cold, distant behavior. It didn't feel genuine. It felt manipulative. "Peyton, I want you to show me something. Can you take me to his office?" She looked confused but nodded, leading me down the hallway to a room I'd only glimpsed in passing during previous visits. The door was closed as it usually was, but unlocked now. The office was quintessentially Matthew, everything organized to the point of obsession, files labeled and arranged by date, not a single paper out of place. But as I looked more carefully, I began to notice things that seemed odd. On his desk was a small pile of documents that didn't match the usual orderliness of the room. Medical records, but not recent ones. Some were dated several years ago. I could see partial letterheads from hospitals and clinics I didn't recognize. "Has Matthew ever mentioned having medical issues?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Peyton shook her head. "He's always been obsessive about his health, but he's never said anything about being sick." "Why?" I moved closer to the desk, pretending to admire a photo while actually trying to read the papers underneath. What I could see made my stomach tighten with unease. Genetic counseling, developmental delays, risk factors. "Peyton, when you two were dating, did he ever talk about wanting children? Specifically?" She perched on the edge of his desk chair, thinking. "He said he wanted a family, but now that I think about it, he was always vague about the details. When I'd talk about baby names or what kind of parents we'd be, he'd change the subject." I opened one of his desk drawers, justifying the invasion of privacy as necessary under the circumstances. Inside, beneath some business cards and pens, I found a small pharmacy bottle. The label had been partially torn off, but I could make out enough to see it was a prescription for anxiety medication, filled just 2 months ago. "Did you know Matthew was taking medication for anxiety?" Peyton's eyes widened as I showed her the bottle. "No, he never mentioned it. He always seemed so calm, so in control of everything." But even as she said it, I could see her thinking back, remembering moments that might have been signs. The way he sometimes gripped the steering wheel too tightly when driving. How he insisted on checking and rechecking locks before bed. His need to control every aspect of their social calendar. The sound of the shower running upstairs reminded us that we didn't have much time. I opened another drawer, this one containing hanging files. Most were labeled with mundane categories: insurance, taxes, warranties. But one file, pushed toward the back, caught my attention. It was unmarked, and when I pulled it out, I found it contained newspaper clippings. My hands began to shake as I read the headlines. "Local man charged with child abandonment. Father loses custody rights in neglect case." The articles were from a city about 200 miles away, dated 5 years ago. The name in the articles wasn't Matthew, but the photos were too grainy to make out clearly. "Mom, what is it?" Peyton asked, seeing my expression. Before I could answer, the shower upstairs stopped running. I quickly put the file back where I'd found it, but not before noticing one more thing that made my blood run cold. A business card paper-clipped to one of the articles. A lawyer who specialized in terminating parental rights. We hurried back to the living room, both of us trying to look normal when Matthew came downstairs wearing fresh clothes, his hair still damp. He seemed calmer now, more like his usual controlled self, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting toward his office door. "I'm sorry for worrying you both," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "This pregnancy has brought up some unexpected emotions, but I'm fine now. We're going to be fine." The words sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. Peyton wanted so desperately to believe him that she immediately moved to his side, seeking the reassurance of his embrace, but I watched his face as he held her, And what I saw there wasn't love or protectiveness. It was resignation, like a man who had just accepted an unavoidable fate. As I prepared to leave that evening, promising Peyton I'd check on her the next day, Matthew walked me to my car. In the fading light of the driveway, away from Peyton's hopeful eyes, his mask slipped just slightly. "She doesn't need to know everything about my past, Pamela," he said quietly. "Some things are better left buried." The words were obviously meant as a warning, but they only strengthened my resolve. My daughter was about to bring a child into the world with a man who was hiding something significant enough to make him consider running away from his own family. I was going to find out what that something was, whether Matthew wanted me to or not. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Matthew's face in the driveway, heard his warning about leaving the past buried. By 4 a.m, I gave up trying to rest and made myself coffee, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open. The newspaper clippings I'd found haunted me. The dates, the headlines about child abandonment, it couldn't be a coincidence. I started with a simple internet search, typing in the city name from the articles and the date range. What I found in the first few results made my coffee go cold. "Local father flees after son's diagnosis," read one headline from exactly 5 years and 3 months ago. The article was brief but devastating. A man named Marcus Thompson had abandoned his wife and infant son after the child was diagnosed with a developmental disability. The wife, Sarah Thompson, had filed charges when she discovered her husband had emptied their joint bank account and disappeared without a trace. Marcus Thompson, not Matthew Richardson, the name on my son-in-law's driver's license and credit cards. But as I kept reading, the pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. I found Sarah Thompson's social media profile, and my heart nearly stopped. The profile picture showed a woman about Peyton's age holding a little boy with the brightest smile I'd ever seen. The child had the distinctive features of Down syndrome, and according to the posts, his name was Jacob. Jacob, the name Matthew had said on the phone yesterday. I can't do this again. Not another Jacob. With shaking fingers, I scrolled through Sarah's posts from the past 5 years. They painted a picture of a single mother raising her son alone, working 2 jobs to afford his therapy and special education needs. Her posts were filled with love for Jacob. Photos of his first steps, his progress in speech therapy, his joy at simple pleasures like feeding ducks at the park. But scattered among the happy updates were glimpses of her struggle. Posts about sleepless nights when Jacob had difficulty sleeping, about the financial strain of his medical needs, about the loneliness of doing it all alone. And always, underlying everything, was the pain of abandonment. One post from 2 years ago made me physically sick. Jacob asked me today why he doesn't have a daddy like the other kids. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his father left because he was disappointed in him? Some days I hate Marcus Thompson more than I thought possible. I found more articles, court records, even a missing person report filed by Sarah when Marcus first disappeared. The timeline was becoming clearer. Marcus Thompson had abandoned his family 5 years ago, and sometime in the past 4 years, he had reinvented himself as Matthew Richardson. But how? How does someone completely change their identity? I kept digging, and what I found was a systematic fraud that showed just how calculating Matthew really was. Marcus Thompson had been declared legally dead 2 years ago, after Sarah petitioned the court following 3 years of no contact and no financial support. This legal death had allowed Matthew to create his new identity more easily, obtaining documents under his new name while his old life was officially closed. The man my daughter married was not just hiding his past. He was a fraud who had abandoned a disabled child and the woman who loved him. I printed everything I could find, my hands shaking as page after page emerged from my printer. Photos of Jacob, court documents, news articles, evidence of Matthew's true character spread across my kitchen table like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. By 7 a.m, I was dressed and driving toward Peyton's house. I found her in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, making breakfast for Matthew, who sat at the table reading something on his phone with intense concentration. "Mom!" Peyton's face lit up when she saw me. "You're early. I was just making Matthew's favorite omelet. Matthew looked up from his phone, and I saw wariness flash across his features when he saw the manila folder in my hands. Good morning, Marcus, I said quietly, watching as all the color drained from his face. Peyton froze, the spatula in her hand dripping egg onto the floor. Mom, what did you call him? Matthew, Marcus, stood up slowly, his phone clattering to the table. Pamela, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I know about Jacob, I interrupted, opening the folder and pulling out Sarah's profile picture. I know about your son. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Peyton looked back and forth between us, confusion and growing fear written across her face. What son? Matthew. What is she talking about? He sat back down heavily, his head dropping into his hands. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the little boy in the photos, the woman raising him alone, and my resolve hardened. His name is Jacob Thompson, I continued, pulling out more photos. He's 7 years old now. He has Down syndrome, and his father abandoned him and his mother when he was just 6 months old. Peyton's hand went to her throat, the spatula dropping to the floor with a clatter. That's not possible. Matthew doesn't have any children. He told me his parents died, that he didn't have any family. Show her, I said to Matthew, sliding the court documents across the table. Show her who you really are. He looked up at me with eyes that held no remorse, only the cold calculation of someone whose carefully constructed lie was falling apart. You have no idea what you've done, he said quietly. I've protected my daughter from making the biggest mistake of her life, I shot back. Peyton grabbed the documents, her eyes scanning them frantically. I watched as the truth hit her in waves. Confusion, denial, horror, and finally, devastating understanding. Marcus Thompson, she read aloud from one of the court papers, charged with willful abandonment of a minor child, failure to pay child support. Her voice broke. This is you? This is really you? Matthew, I couldn't think of him by any other name now, finally looked at her directly. Yes. The single word hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand pressed against her growing belly in an instinctively protective gesture. You have a son, she whispered. You have a son with special needs, and you left him. It wasn't that simple, he began. It was exactly that simple, I exploded, no longer able to contain my rage. You took one look at that beautiful little boy, decided he wasn't perfect enough for you, and you ran. You drained the bank account and disappeared, leaving a woman with a newborn special needs child to fend for herself. Peyton was reading more of the documents, her face growing paler with each page. The police report says Sarah filed for child support, but they couldn't find you to serve the papers. That's because you were busy becoming Matthew Richardson, wasn't it? He didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. How long have you been lying to me? Peyton's voice was getting stronger now, anger beginning to replace shock. Since the day we met? Was anything about our relationship real? My feelings for you are real, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Your feelings? Peyton laughed bitterly. You don't have feelings. People with feelings don't abandon their children. They don't steal from their wives. They don't spend 3 years lying to someone who loves them. I pulled out the final document I'd printed, a recent photo from Sarah's social media showing Jacob at school, proudly holding up a painting he'd made. In the photo, he was wearing a t-shirt that said, "World's Best Son." This is what you walked away from, I said, placing the photo in front of him. This is the child you decided wasn't worth your love. Matthew stared at the photo for a long moment, and I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe, or grief. But then he pushed the photo away and looked up at Peyton with cold eyes. I won't make the same mistake twice, he said. If this baby has problems, I'm not staying to watch you struggle the way Sarah did. The cruelty of those words hung in the air like poison. Peyton's face went white, then red, then white again. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the strength of absolute certainty. Get out, she said. Get out of my house right now. Matthew stood up, straightening his shirt as if he were preparing for a business meeting rather than the end of his marriage. This is my house too, Peyton. My name is on the deed. Under a false identity, I pointed out. I wonder what the authorities will have to say about that. For the first time since I'd confronted him, Matthew looked genuinely afraid. He glanced toward his office, probably calculating how much evidence he'd need to destroy, how quickly he could disappear again. But Peyton was already one step ahead of him. I changed the locks yesterday, she said, with quiet satisfaction. After you left me crying and worried sick, I called a locksmith. Your keys don't work anymore. His mask of control finally slipped completely. You can't do this. You can't throw me out of my own home. Watch me, Peyton said, pulling her phone from her pocket. I'm calling the police. You can explain to them how Marcus Thompson bought a house using fraudulent documents. As she dialed, Matthew's composure cracked entirely. The man who had seemed so calm and controlled revealed himself to be exactly what he was, a coward who ran from responsibility, a liar who built his life on deception. He grabbed his car keys from the counter and headed for the door, pausing only to look back at Peyton with something that might have been his version of regret. You'll regret this, he said. Both of you will regret this. But as the door slammed behind him, I saw something in my daughter's face that gave me hope. It wasn't regret. It was relief. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Peyton's call. 2 officers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a younger man who took detailed notes as Peyton and I explained the situation. They were professional, but clearly troubled by what they were hearing. So you're saying your husband has been living under a false identity? Officer Martinez asked, reviewing the documents I'd spread across the kitchen table. My soon-to-be ex-husband, Peyton corrected firmly. And yes, his real name is Marcus Thompson. He abandoned his first wife and disabled son 5 years ago, then created a new identity to escape his responsibilities. Officer Martinez picked up the court documents showing Marcus's abandonment charges. We'll need to verify all of this with the original jurisdiction, but if what you're showing us is accurate, this is identity fraud at minimum, possibly several other charges. The younger officer, Rodriguez, looked up from his notes. Has he made any threats toward either of you? Any indication he might become violent? I thought about Matthew's parting words, the cold calculation in his eyes when he realized his secret was exposed. He said we'd regret this. I'm not sure if that was a threat or just anger talking. We'll document everything, Officer Martinez assured us. In the meantime, I'd recommend changing all your passwords, monitoring your bank accounts, and keeping your doors locked. Men who build elaborate false identities are often capable of other deceptive behaviors. After the officers left, Peyton and I sat in her living room, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's betrayal. She kept picking up different documents, reading them as if hoping the words would change. I feel so stupid, she said finally, tears starting to fall again. How did I not see this? How did I marry someone I didn't even know? I moved closer to her on the couch, putting my arm around her shoulders. He was very good at lying, sweetheart. This wasn't some impulsive deception. He spent years creating this false identity. He fooled everyone, not just you. But there were signs, weren't there? She wiped her eyes with a tissue. The way he never wanted to talk about his past, how he controlled everything about our social life, how he never seemed emotionally connected to anything. I just thought he was private, maybe a little reserved. We were interrupted by Peyton's phone ringing. The caller ID showed a number neither of us recognized, but when Peyton answered, I could hear a woman's voice on the other end. Is this Peyton Richardson? The voice asked. Yes, who is this? My name is Sarah Thompson. I think we need to talk. Peyton's eyes went wide, and she looked at me with panic. I nodded encouragingly, mouthing, Put it on speaker. Mrs. Thompson, Peyton said, her voice shaking slightly. I just found out about everything, about Marcus, about your son. I'm so sorry. There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came through the speaker, tired but determined. I saw the police activity report online this morning. When I saw Marcus Thompson's name and the address, I put 2 and 2 together. He's been living as Matthew Richardson, hasn't he? Yes, Peyton whispered. For 3 years. We're married. I'm pregnant. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought the call might have dropped. Finally, Sarah spoke again, and her voice was filled with a mixture of sympathy and anger. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I know exactly what you're going through right now. The shock, the feeling of betrayal. But I need to warn you about something. Marcus doesn't just run when things get difficult. He gets vindictive." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning closer to the phone. "When I first filed the abandonment charges, he tried to claim that Jacob wasn't his son. Even though we have DNA tests proving paternity, he contested everything. When that didn't work, he started spreading lies about me, telling people I was an unfit mother, that I was keeping his son from him. He even called Child Protective Services and made false reports. My blood ran cold. He tried to have Jacob taken away from you? 3 different times. Each report was investigated and dismissed, but the stress nearly broke me. I had to hire a lawyer I couldn't afford, miss work for interviews with social workers, prove over and over again that I was a good mother. All while trying to care for a special needs infant by myself. Peyton's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Do you think he'd do something like that to us?" "I think Marcus Thompson is capable of anything when he feels cornered," Sarah said. "But you have one advantage I didn't have. You know who he really is before the baby is born. You can protect yourself and your child." "Mrs. Thompson," I interjected, "would you be willing to testify about what he did to you and Jacob? Help us make sure he can't hurt anyone else?" "I've been waiting 5 years for someone to ask me that question," Sarah replied. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he faces consequences for what he did." We talked for another hour, Sarah sharing details about Marcus's behavior that painted a picture of a man far more dangerous than we'd realized. He hadn't just abandoned his family. He'd systematically tried to destroy Sarah's life when she'd fought for child support. After we hung up, Peyton seemed different. The shock and hurt were still there, but they were being replaced by something stronger: determination. "I want to meet them," she said suddenly. "Meet who?" "Sarah and Jacob. I want to see the child my husband abandoned. I want to look at that little boy and understand exactly who I married." The next day, we drove the 200 miles to Sarah's city. She had agreed to meet us at a park where Jacob liked to play, somewhere public but comfortable for him. I saw them before Peyton did. A petite woman with brown hair sitting on a bench, watching a little boy navigate the playground equipment with the focused determination that seemed characteristic of children with Down syndrome. Even from a distance, I could see Jacob's joy in the simple act of climbing and sliding. "That's them," I told Peyton softly. We approached slowly, not wanting to startle Jacob. Sarah stood when she saw us, and I was struck by how young she looked despite everything she'd been through. She couldn't have been much older than Peyton. "You must be Peyton," she said, offering her hand. There was no accusation in her voice, no blame, just weary recognition of a shared experience. "I'm so sorry," Peyton said immediately. "I'm sorry for what he did to you, and I'm sorry it took me this long to learn the truth." Sarah smiled sadly. "You're not responsible for his choices. None of us are." Jacob had noticed the new arrivals and was making his way over to us with that open curiosity that children often display. Up close, he was even more beautiful than in the photos. Bright eyes, a quick smile, and an energy that was immediately infectious. "Mama, who are the ladies?" he asked, his speech clear despite the slight delay that often accompanies Down syndrome. "These are new friends, baby. This is Peyton and Pamela." Jacob looked at Peyton with particular interest, his gaze settling on her pregnant belly. "Do you have a baby in there?" Peyton knelt down to his level, tears already starting to form. "Yes, I do. A little boy, like you." "That's exciting." Jacob clapped his hands together. "Babies are the best. I help Mama take care of babies sometimes at her work." I watched Peyton's face as Jacob chatted about his favorite things: dinosaurs, his speech therapy teacher, the songs he was learning in his special music class. This was the child Marcus Thompson had walked away from. This bright, loving, joyful little boy who had been deemed not perfect enough by the man who had claimed to love Peyton. "Jacob is in 1st grade now," Sarah explained as her son went back to playing. "He's reading at grade level, which his teachers say is remarkable. He's also in a soccer league for kids with special needs, and he's learning to play piano. He's incredible, Peyton said, her voice thick with emotion. How could anyone walk away from him? The same way he was planning to walk away from your son if something was wrong, Sarah replied gently. Marcus doesn't see children as people to love unconditionally. He sees them as reflections of himself, and anything that doesn't match his idea of perfection is disposable. As we sat there watching Jacob play, Sarah told us more about the legal battles she'd faced. Marcus had tried to contest the paternity tests, claimed the child support amounts were excessive, and even attempted to have the abandonment charges dismissed by claiming he'd left for work-related reasons and planned to return. The worst part wasn't the money, Sarah said. It was watching Jacob ask for his daddy and not knowing how to explain that some people just leave. But you know what? Jacob is better off without him. We both are. How do you do it? Peyton asked. Raise him alone, work, handle all the medical appointments and therapy? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. You find strength you didn't know you had. And you realize that love really is enough, even when it has to stretch to cover two people. Jacob has taught me more about resilience and joy than I ever taught him. As we prepared to leave, Jacob ran over to Peyton one more time. I hope your baby likes dinosaurs, he said seriously. All the best babies like dinosaurs. Peyton laughed through her tears. I'll make sure to tell him that. On the drive home, Peyton was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. I know what I have to do now, she said. I'm going to make sure Marcus Thompson faces justice for what he did to Sarah and Jacob. And I'm going to make sure my son never has to wonder why his father left. What do you mean? She placed her hand on her belly, her voice steady and sure. I'm going to be enough for both of us, just like Sarah was for Jacob. That night, as we sat in Peyton's living room planning our next steps, her phone rang. It was Marcus, calling from yet another unknown number. This time, Peyton answered with confidence. What do you want, Marcus? I want to work this out, Peyton. We can fix this. There's nothing to fix. You're a liar and a fraud who abandoned a disabled child. I could never trust you with my son. Our son, he corrected, his voice taking on an edge. And I have rights. Not under a false identity, you don't. And not after what I learned about your pattern of behavior. There was a pause. Then his voice turned cold and threatening. You're making a mistake, Peyton. You'll regret crossing me. But for the first time since this nightmare began, my daughter sounded completely unafraid. No, Marcus. You're the one who's going to regret it. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. The threatening phone calls started 3 days after our conversation with Sarah. They came at all hours, 2 in the morning during Peyton's lunch break, while she was at her prenatal appointments, always from different numbers, always the same voice, always the same message delivered in Marcus's coldly controlled tone. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Peyton. Just drop the charges and we can work something out. Think about what's best for the baby. A child needs his father. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Some fights aren't worth having. Each call left Peyton more shaken, though she tried to hide it from me. I could see the stress in the way she held her shoulders, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she jumped every time her phone rang. At 24 weeks pregnant, this kind of emotional turmoil could be dangerous for both her and the baby. We need to get you a restraining order, I told her after a particularly unnerving call where Marcus had somehow gotten hold of her work number and called her directly at the insurance office where she worked as a claims adjuster. He's not technically threatening me, Peyton said wearily, sinking into her kitchen chair with one hand pressed to her lower back. He's just being persistent. The police said unless he explicitly threatens harm, there's not much they can do about the calls. But I knew what Marcus was doing. He was wearing her down, trying to make fighting him seem more exhausting than just giving in. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. I could see my strong, determined daughter starting to crumble under the constant pressure. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. Peyton had just returned from her doctor's appointment, looking more tired than usual. Her blood pressure was elevated, Dr. Martinez had told her, likely due to stress. She needed to find ways to relax, to minimize the anxiety in her life. As if on cue, her phone rang. Another unknown number. "Don't answer it," I said, but Peyton was already reaching for the phone with a resigned expression. "Hello, Marcus," she said flatly, but this time it wasn't Marcus on the other end. It was a woman's voice, older, with the careful diction of someone used to getting her way. "Is this Peyton Richardson?" "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm Marcus's mother." Peyton's eyes went wide and she quickly put the phone on speaker. According to everything Marcus had told her, his parents were dead. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake," Peyton said carefully. "My husband told me his parents died years ago." Margaret Thompson let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he did. Marcus has been telling people we're dead for years. It's easier than admitting he has a family that doesn't approve of his choices." I leaned closer to the phone. "Mrs. Thompson, why are you calling?" "Because I've been watching the news reports about my son's arrest warrant. Because I know he's out there somewhere, probably planning to run again rather than face the consequences of what he's done. And because I have something to tell you about my grandson Jacob that you need to hear." My heart started pounding. What about Jacob? "Marcus didn't just abandon that child because he has Down syndrome," Margaret said, her voice heavy with shame. "He abandoned him because Jacob isn't his biological son." The silence in Peyton's kitchen was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming. Finally, Peyton found her voice. "What are you supposed to mean?" "Sarah had an affair during her marriage to Marcus. When Jacob was born and tested positive for Down syndrome, Marcus demanded a paternity test. When it came back showing he wasn't the biological father, he felt justified in leaving. He's been using Jacob's disability as the excuse for his abandonment, but the real reason was that the child wasn't his. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. But Sarah said they had DNA tests proving paternity. "Those tests were forged," Margaret said quietly. "Sarah was so desperate to have Marcus take responsibility for the child she'd been raising as his that she falsified the documents. Marcus knew, but he used the real paternity results to justify his decision to leave." Peyton was staring at the phone in shock. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because my son is a coward and a liar, but he's not a monster who abandons disabled children. He's just a selfish man who won't raise another man's child." Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "I'm not defending what he did. Leaving Sarah to raise Jacob alone was cruel regardless of paternity. But I wanted you to know the whole truth before you make your decision about your marriage." After Margaret hung up, Peyton and I sat in stunned silence. Everything we thought we knew about Marcus's character had just been turned upside down. He was still a fraud who had assumed a false identity, still a man who had left a woman to struggle alone with a special needs child. But the narrative of a father abandoning his disabled son was more complicated than we'd understood. "What do we do with this information?" Peyton asked finally. Before I could answer, her phone rang again. This time, it was Sarah. "Peyton, I need to tell you something," Sarah said without preamble, her voice thick with tears. "Something I should have told you yesterday. Sarah, we just heard from Marcus's mother. We know about the paternity test." Sarah let out a sob. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I lied to you. I was just so angry when I saw that he'd built a whole new life while Jacob and I struggled. I wanted him to face consequences for leaving us, even if the legal grounds were false." "Whose son is Jacob, really?" I asked gently. "A coworker of mine from 5 years ago." Marcus suspected something was wrong when Jacob was born, because the timing didn't quite match up with when we'd been intimate. He demanded the paternity test, and when it came back negative, he just left. He said he wasn't going to raise another man's child, especially not one with disabilities. Peyton was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did Marcus ever hurt you? Physically, I mean?" "No," Sarah said immediately. "He was cold, he was selfish, but he was never violent. When he left, he just disappeared. No drama, no confrontation, just gone one morning with half our savings." After that call ended, Peyton and I found ourselves facing a dilemma we hadn't expected. Marcus was still guilty of identity fraud, still a man who had lived under false pretenses for 3 years. But the picture of him as a father who abandoned his disabled child was no longer accurate. "Does this change anything for you?" I asked Peyton carefully. She was quiet for a long time, her hands resting on her belly as she thought. "It changes how I see his past, but it doesn't change who he is now. He's still someone who lied to me about his identity for 3 years. He's still someone who built our entire relationship on a foundation of deception, and he's still someone who's threatening and harassing me rather than trying to have an honest conversation about our future." As if summoned by her words, her phone rang again. This time, we could see it was Marcus calling from what appeared to be his real number. "Answer it," I told her. "Let's hear what he has to say now that the whole truth is out." Peyton took a deep breath and answered. "Hello, Marcus. Peyton, thank you for taking my call. I know my mother contacted you. I know she told you about Jacob's real parentage." "She did. Then you understand why I left. I'm not the monster you thought I was. I just couldn't raise another man's child, especially one with such significant needs." Peyton's voice was steady when she replied. "What I understand is that you let Sarah and Jacob suffer for 5 years rather than tell the truth about paternity. You could have cleared this up legally years ago, but you chose to disappear instead. I was young, I was scared. You were 28 years old, Marcus. You weren't some teenager making a mistake. You were a grown man who chose the coward's way out. But now you know I'm not someone who abandons disabled children. That has to count for something." Peyton looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made me proud. The steel of a woman who had learned to see clearly through deception. "What it tells me," she said, "is that you're someone who will run from any situation that doesn't meet your exact specifications. What happens if our son has allergies, or learning disabilities, or just doesn't live up to your expectations? What happens if I get sick, or lose my job, or become inconvenient in some way? That's not fair." "It's completely fair. You've shown me exactly who you are, Marcus. You're someone who lies when the truth is uncomfortable, who disappears when life gets complicated, and who threatens people when they won't let you control the narrative." I heard Marcus's voice change, becoming colder. "You're making a mistake, Peyton. I'm offering you a chance to save our marriage." "No, you're offering me a chance to pretend the last week didn't happen. To go back to living with someone whose name I don't even know, whose past is a complete fabrication. I can't do that." "Think about the baby." "I am thinking about the baby," Peyton interrupted. "I'm thinking about what kind of father he deserves. And that's not someone who will disappear the moment life becomes challenging." After she hung up, Peyton turned to me with tears in her eyes, but her voice was strong. "I know what I have to do, Mom. I know it's going to be hard being a single mother, but I can't stay with someone I don't trust to be there when things get difficult." "You won't be alone," I promised her. "We'll figure this out together." But even as I said the words, I worried about what Marcus might do next. A man who had reinvented himself completely once was capable of almost anything when cornered. And despite what his mother had said about him not being violent, the threatening phone calls suggested he wasn't going to accept defeat gracefully. That night, as I helped Peyton pack some of his remaining belongings to leave on the porch for pickup, we found something that changed everything again. Hidden in the back of his closet, behind a box of old business clothes, was a small suitcase we'd never seen before. Inside were documents that made our blood run cold. A new driver's license in the name of Michael Richardson, dated just 2 weeks ago. A bank account statement showing Marcus had been slowly transferring money into an account under his new assumed name. And most chilling of all, a rental agreement for an apartment 3 states away, signed just 5 days after Peyton's ultrasound appointment. "He was planning to run again," Peyton whispered, holding the fake ID with shaking hands. "The moment he found out we were having a boy, he started planning his escape." I stared at the documents, feeling cold rage wash over me. He never had any intention of staying, regardless of what you decided about the marriage. He was just buying time to set up his new life. Peyton sank onto the bed, the weight of this final betrayal hitting her. What kind of person does this? What kind of person plans to abandon his pregnant wife? But I could see something else in her face now, alongside the hurt and anger. Relief. Because now there was no question. No doubt about whether she was making the right decision. Marcus had made it for her. The kind of person, I said, putting my arm around my daughter, that you and your son are better off without. 6 months later, I stood in the delivery room holding my grandson for the first time. 8 pounds, 2 ounces of perfect healthy baby boy, with his mother's determined chin and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calm intelligence. What are you going to name him? I asked Peyton as she cradled him against her chest. She smiled, looking more at peace than I'd seen her since this whole nightmare began. Daniel. It means God is my judge. I want him to grow up knowing that the only approval that matters comes from above and from the people who truly love him. Daniel. Not after any family member, not carrying forward any legacy of pain or deception. Just a strong name for a boy who would grow up knowing he was wanted and loved unconditionally. The legal proceedings against Marcus had concluded just 2 weeks before Daniel's birth. He'd been arrested in Arizona attempting to assume yet another identity, this time as Michael Roberts. The authorities found evidence of at least 4 different false identities he'd created over the past 8 years, along with a pattern of abandoning relationships whenever they became complicated. It turned out that Peyton wasn't his first victim. There had been 2 other women before Sarah, both of whom he'd married under false names and left when the relationships required real commitment. One had been pregnant when he disappeared, the other had been caring for her elderly mother. Both had struggled for years with the financial and emotional aftermath of his abandonment. Marcus would spend the next 3 years in federal prison for identity fraud, wire fraud, and bigamy. The sentence felt like justice, but more importantly, it felt like closure. Any word from his family? I asked Peyton as we settled into our routine with Daniel. His mother sent a card, Peyton said, gently bouncing the baby as he fussed. She apologized again for everything Marcus put us through. She said she'd like to meet Daniel someday, but she understands if I don't want any connection to that part of his past. I watched my daughter with her son, marveling at how natural she looked as a mother. The stress and fear that had marked her final months of pregnancy had been replaced by a quiet confidence that seemed to grow stronger every day. Do you ever regret not trying to work things out with him? I asked carefully. It was a question that had been weighing on my mind, especially after learning the full complexity of Marcus's past deceptions. Peyton looked at me with clear eyes. Never, not once. Even if he'd been telling the truth about everything else, the fact that he was planning to abandon me and Daniel the moment he learned we were having a son tells me everything I need to know about his character. She adjusted Daniel in her arms as he settled back into sleep. I keep thinking about what Sarah told us about finding strength she didn't know she had. I'm starting to understand what she meant. The transformation in Peyton over the past months had been remarkable. The woman who had once deferred to Marcus's preferences in everything from dinner choices to social plans had become someone who made decisions with quiet authority. She'd taken charge of the legal proceedings, handled the sale of the house they'd shared, and created a new life for herself and her son with determination that impressed everyone around her. I've been thinking about something, she said as we moved to the nursery I'd helped her set up in her new apartment. It was small but filled with warmth, soft colors, books already waiting on the shelves, a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. What's that? I want to help other women who've been through what I went through. Not necessarily identity fraud, but women who discover they've been living with men who aren't who they pretended to be. I settled into the rocking chair while she changed Daniel's diaper with the efficiency she'd developed over the past few weeks. What kind of help? Support groups, maybe. Resources for women dealing with the legal and financial aftermath of deceptive marriages. I've learned so much about protecting yourself legally when your partner has been living under false pretenses. She lifted Daniel and handed him to me, then sat on the small couch across from the chair. That sounds like something that could help a lot of women, I said, feeling proud of how she'd turned her painful experience into something potentially beneficial for others. I already contacted that organization that helps victims of domestic fraud. They're interested in having me speak at their next conference. Peyton tucked her feet under her, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. I never thought I'd be grateful for what Marcus put us through, but in some ways, It showed me who I really am, underneath all the people-pleasing and conflict avoidance. As I rocked Daniel, I thought about how much had changed since that desperate phone call 6 months ago. The frightened woman who had begged for help had become someone who was planning to help others navigate similar crises. "Any word from Sarah?" I asked. Peyton's face lit up. "She and Jacob are coming to visit next month. She's so excited to meet Daniel, and Jacob has been asking about his baby friend every day since I called to tell them he was born." The friendship between Peyton and Sarah had been unexpected, but genuine. Despite the complicated history that had brought them together, they'd found common ground in their experiences of rebuilding their lives after Marcus's deceptions. Sarah had become one of Peyton's strongest supporters throughout the pregnancy and legal proceedings. "Jacob wants to teach Daniel about dinosaurs as soon as he's old enough to understand," Peyton continued with a laugh. "Sarah says he's been practicing his big brother skills by helping with the younger kids in his special education class." I looked down at Daniel, sleeping peacefully in my arms, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. This innocent child would never know his biological father, but he would grow up surrounded by people who valued honesty, integrity, and unconditional love. In some ways, Marcus's abandonment had been the greatest gift he could have given his son. "Peyton," I said softly, "I need you to know how proud I am of you, not just for how you've handled this situation, but for the person you've become through it." She smiled, and I could see the girl she'd been before Marcus's influence had dimmed her confidence. "I'm proud of me too. For the first time in years, I actually like who I am." Daniel stirred in my arms, making the small sounds that meant he was waking up hungry. As Peyton prepared for his feeding, I marveled at how efficiently she'd learned to manage single motherhood. There were challenges, of course. Sleepless nights, financial adjustments, the occasional moment of loneliness. But there was also a peace in their small apartment that had never existed in the house she'd shared with Marcus. "Do you miss anything about your old life?" I asked as she settled back into the rocking chair with Daniel. She considered the question seriously. "I miss feeling like I was part of a traditional family structure. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if Daniel had a father who actually wanted to be here. But I don't miss the constant underlying tension of living with someone I couldn't fully trust. I don't miss second-guessing my instincts because Marcus always made me feel like I was overreacting to things." She looked down at Daniel, who was nursing contentedly. "I want Daniel to grow up seeing healthy relationships, even if they're not the traditional nuclear family model. I want him to see that love doesn't require perfect circumstances, just honest commitment." As the afternoon light faded outside the nursery windows, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My daughter had faced one of the most devastating betrayals imaginable and had emerged stronger, more self-aware, and more determined to create a life based on authentic values rather than appearances. "Mom," Peyton said, as Daniel finished eating and settled back into sleep. "Thank you." "For what?" "For believing me when I called you that day. For investigating when something felt wrong. For standing by me through all of this." She paused, adjusting the blanket around Daniel. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't found the truth about Marcus, if I'd stayed with him, trusted him to be there for Daniel. But you did find out," I interrupted gently, "and you made the right choice for both of you." "We made the right choice," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this alone." As I prepared to leave that evening, I stood in the doorway of their small apartment and felt overwhelmed by how much love could exist in such a modest space. Peyton had traded a large house with expensive furnishings for a 2-bedroom apartment with secondhand furniture, but she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: peace of mind and the knowledge that every person in her life was there by choice, not deception. 3 months later, I received a text message with a photo attached. It showed Peyton speaking at a conference, holding Daniel as she addressed a room full of women. The caption read, "Daniel's first speaking engagement. He slept through the whole thing, but I think he approves of helping other families find their way to the truth." Looking at that photo, I realized that Marcus's greatest failure had been his inability to see what he was walking away from. He'd been so focused on avoiding anything that didn't meet his narrow definition of perfection that he'd missed the opportunity to be part of something genuinely beautiful. A family built on truth, resilience, and unconditional love. Instead, he'd chosen the hollow satisfaction of deception and control. While he sat in a prison cell, isolated and alone, his son was growing up surrounded by people who valued authenticity above appearances and love above convenience. Daniel would never know his father, but he would know something more important. He would know that he was wanted, cherished, and supported by people who had chosen him not because he was perfect, but because love doesn't require perfection. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you exactly who they are before it's too late to protect yourself and the people you love. Marcus Thompson had done that, and in the end, it had set us all free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.